Hey everybody, it's Lindsay here with our friend and astrologer Sam Reynolds to help us understand what is in store for this upcoming cycle, new moon in Pisces and full moon in Virgo. Hey Sam.
Hey, hi everybody. Hi Lindsay.
And I just want to remind everyone who's watching that when we're talking about these different astrological signs, it doesn't matter per se if you have a sun in Pisces or a moon in Pisces or nothing at all in Pisces. The fact is that each sign represents an aspect of our psyche, and we all have access to this part of our psyche. So when the moon and the sun are in this sign, it gives us a little moment and a little window where we can tune into that part of ourselves and see what wisdom lies there. So, what does Pisces bring for us?
As a sign of Jupiter, we're dealing more so with the expansiveness on a more or a less material level, more emotional, more imaginal, more spiritual. So there's ways in which we can experience the world when we're talking about the other Jupiter sign, which is Sagittarius, and that becomes a lot more physical. That becomes a lot more about getting out there. When we're talking about the other more internal, watery home of Jupiter, then we're going to be talking more about the inner realms, how we kind of journey in through the mind, through our hearts, those kinds of ways.
So, it's more of the inner world,
That's
more
correct.
so than the outer world.
Yes.
Is, is that why the Piscean energy is often associated with kind of being like a dreamer or ungrounded in physical reality?
For many modern astrologers, Pisces has come under the rulership or connection to Neptune. So Neptune is, as I describe Neptune, the fog planet, how we have the experience of um, feeling lost, ungrounded, uprooted, more in the realms of imagination, more in the realms of even possible deception. I gave a positive and a negative.
How do Virgo and Pisces kind of speak to each other or dance together?
Again, we have to start with their rulers. So Jupiter is the ruler for Pisces, but the ruler, or what we could say as the super, for those who live in rented buildings, right, is a super. There's someone on the grounds who maintains the property. The super for Virgo is Mercury. So there's more so when we're talking about Virgo as a polar opposite, we go from talking about where we experience the expanse of our emotions and inner life to where we feel more the contraction in terms of both our appreciation and understanding of the external world and wanting to get more of the details. We go from thinking about compassion in Pisces in one particular way and thinking more about competence in Virgo.
I know that a lot of folks are talking about and thinking about Mercury retrograde
Yeah.
right now. And I know we've had some conversations. We've talked about how Mercury retrograde gets this like really bad reputation and people start blaming all kinds of things on Mercury retrograde. And I thought it'd be great if we could talk a little bit about what Mercury retrograde means, but also specifically what it looks like when it's in Pisces. And I think also through Aquarius, if I'm not mistaken.
He goes back to, or she, they go back to Aquarius. And that's the great thing about Mercury, and that even gives us a window in appreciating Mercury. Mercury is malleable,
Mhm.
both in terms of how we may talk about it in terms of gender, also in terms of other things that are important in astrology in terms of um, Mercury's actual qualities, whether he's like quote unquote hot and wet or cold and dry. So he
Mhm.
changes depending on where he is in relation to the sun. So what's about to happen as Mercury is retrograding is that he's coming toward a conjunction with the sun. And that's kind of like a point of rebirth.
So Mercury runs around the sun, and the Earth is running around the sun too, but slower. And so it's like Mercury gets to where it was going first, and then as the Earth is catching up, that's what makes the Mercury look like it's going backwards. Is
That's
that
exactly right. Right. That's kind of what is happening for people um, who are attached to the old ways of doing mercurial things. And mercurial things are everything that deals with commuting, communication, and commerce. So if you're kind of hung up on doing things just a set way, those three things, commuting, communication, and commerce, then this can be a really frustrating time for you, because if Mercury is kind of signifying how now all those things are going toward renewal, refreshing, change, if you don't want to change, then it's going to be really hard for you. And that's what people are kvetching about with Mercury retrograde. They don't want to kind of pay attention to where things need some measure of rehabilitation. And you notice I'm using a lot of words, which is very key to understanding Mercury, revisiting and rethinking and retooling. All those are great things to start working with during a Mercury retrograde.
And I think during a Mercury retrograde, we're invited to explore other ways of knowing, like your intuitive self, your dream self, your, all the other places besides your mind, which is what Mercury, to me, represents, that logos, the words and the and it's fast and it's quick, and we value that in a very young oriented society. But then Mercury retrograde comes and it's like, first of all, slow down. Second of all, sit down. Third of all, what do you feel? Not just what do you think, but, if you're getting a hunch about something and you have a tendency to bypass that, or to not trust your intuition or your heart because it doesn't make sense, then these are the places where Mercury retrograde is going to trip you up. So if I have this thought of like, oh man, maybe I should take the train instead of driving today, and I just had this intuitive hit about that, but I'm like, oh no, it doesn't make sense. I'm going to drive anyway. And then I'm driving and there's a car accident and I'm stuck waiting for 3 extra hours. It's like, I had that moment where I could have listened to another part of myself instead of just my mind.
Right. Or especially for relationships,
oh my
if
God,
you're always in the habit of texting, then it might be a good idea to kind of switch it up and also get on the phone or call or wait until you're in person, because confusion can ensue. Like one of my favorite vignettes is kind of this vignette between Key and Peele, where they're texting, and because you can't properly see tone or grasp tone always in a text, what's happening is that there's an escalation between these two, between Key and Peele, where one is texting the other and increasingly getting more upset because the other is misperceiving like a change or an aggressive tone that isn't there. Like you can visibly see it, but the other one's like, oh, you want to play? Okay. I'll be, like, I think that's a perpetual Mercury retrograde moment.
I mean, I think about it as like a slow down period. It's like all the things that I've been rushing through, didn't put a lot of maybe as much detail, didn't complete in the way that is satisfactory. It's like this renewal, refresh time for me to kind of go back and look at those things again and say, okay, is this how we're moving forward? Or is there something in this that needs to be tweaked, re-examined, refreshed, renewed, revisited at this time?
Or renegotiated. I mean, that's another way to think about too.
Yeah.
So, if you got a bum deal with something recently, it might be a good time to say, look, I had this issue. Can you help me with this? Like, that can be a way to kind of deal with it. Because a lot of people get caught up in what they perceive as the negative connotations and connections with Mercury retrograde, not thinking about the positive.
What I think about with Mercury in the logos is the words.
Yeah.
And then when I think about like Eros, or the meaning or the feeling or the life force or the chi behind the words.
Right.
And that Mercury retrograde gives us a little bit of an opportunity to tap into that.
Correct.
How does Pisces impact the Mercury retrograde?
A Mercury in Pisces is like being able to kind of come up with the right answer, to formulate the right thoughts, but not know how you got there. It's kind of being able to solve the formula for a math problem, but not show your work. But you still come to the answer because it's more about the intuitive and grasping it and kind of getting to the particulars through a sea of different things that are coming up, whether those are, imaginations or thoughts or intuitions.
Like non-linear thinking.
Correct.
I don't know how I got from A to B, but I'm at B right now. And I got there through some kind of way of thinking that escapes my logical linear awareness.
And that is very good bead and key in to Mercury and Pisces. So the retrograde does, I won't say exacerbate that, but it does punch it up a notch, right? So it's not just any kind of Mercury retrograde, it's kind of Mercury retrograde in Pisces. We're now, it's in the place of its quote unquote fall. So it's more important for us to pay attention, more important to kind of get away from certain aspects of linear thinking, to think out of the box.
You know, I'm all about like, how do we take advantage of whatever's happening cosmically in nature, as above, so below, and how do we work with that energy? And so what I'm excited about this cycle is working with something called archetypes, and working with this idea of these ways of knowing beyond how we normally know, which those of you who work with me know that that's kind of my thing. I'm always like, it doesn't matter what we think, it's more than what we think. There's always something beneath the level of our awareness, our level of awareness, that has a key for us or a nugget for us. And so in looking at archetypes, first I want to just say a little bit about what archetypes are, because I feel like it's a word that I throw around a lot. The best way I can describe an archetype is as a complex of thoughts, feelings, emotions, and perceptions. So it's almost like a lens or a filter through which we look at all of our experiences and the way we move through the world. And so, for example, if I were to say to you, Tony hates my boyfriend, what would you say?
Who's Tony?
Who's Tony? Why do we care?
Mm-hmm.
Why do you care? But if I say, well, Tony is my mother, then there might be a, oh, because already in the word mother, there is a realm of associations that we apply to the word mother. It tells us something. It doesn't tell us everything, but there's a common understanding that is cross-cultural, that is across time. Mother is mother is mother. And so there's this collective idea of mother, and then there's a personal experience with my mother is, or your mother is. So that's the first thing about archetypes, is that they are these symbols or these complexes of energy that transcend space and time, but are transpersonal and personal. So there's what it means for the collective and what it means for me. And so as we're going into this time where we can escape our own thinking a little bit, we have the opportunity to tap into these archetypes that live inside of us. The key thing with archetypes is that they're organizing principles. So it's, like I said, it's a lens, it's a way of channeling how we respond to situations and even how we perceive situations in our lives. So we have, say, the archetype of the lover and the archetype of the warrior. The archetype, the warrior and the lover can be in the same situation, but they're going to respond to what they see differently.
Right.
Because it's a filter or a way of being. Some of the places where we find archetypes represented are in any of the deities or any of the Orisha from different cultures. Those represent archetypal forces. The gods and goddesses of different mythologies represent these archetypes that we can live into. So it's almost like you could say, I'm being like Oshun right now, or I'm being like Aries right now. You know, so these archetypal forces. Astrology, of course, is an archetypal medicine. We could say then we're looking at the tarot, we're looking at myths, we're looking at media and popular culture, and of course nature, as all places where we can find these like archetypal forces that have been around since the beginning, before the beginning. This map is of some common, from a Western lens, some common archetypes that actually are used in advertising. So this, you know, we know that advertising and PR were built out of the social sciences with a real investment into understanding human behavior and what motivates human actions, what's like the motivating force, and how can we use our understanding of what motivates behavior to drive consumerism. But here are some archetypes that are described in this exploration of the basic drives and the basic organizing principles behind our experience. So I made some collages because I also believe that art, when we're channeling the artist within us, we are tapping into these archetypal forces. So I made some collages, and I'm interested in seeing what archetype you might see represented in these collages.
Okay.
Want to try it?
Yes, go.
So if you were to name who this archetype is, what would you say?
I immediately thought of the moon
The moon.
and caregiver.
And I love that because I believe that astrology is one of the oldest archetypal systems.
Mm-hmm.
And so the nurture, this, if we look at it, this translated through a Western kind of PR advertising lens, yeah, it's the nurture, it's the caregiver.
Yeah.
It's the one that kind of has this emotional intimacy with others.
Mm-hmm. That's what I saw.
Okay, what about this one?
Oh, lover. That's the creative. Lover, creative expression. Yeah. Venus, Oshun.
Venus Oshun, the lover. Ding, ding, ding. We're 2 for 2.
Okay.
Okay, let's do another one.
What if I get one wrong? Then what happens? Like I go wah, wah.
I don't think you get them wrong because I feel like they're so entrained in our systems, and I use these images a lot in my practice because so much of what we're trying to bring out of ourselves is nonverbal and beneath the level of our awareness, that sometimes having my patients look at these archetypal images and ask themselves, okay, well, who am I trying to become, or which one of these represents how I function in my life, can give us a lot of insight. Okay, so what about this one?
Oh, this would be, even per the system you showed, the outlaw.
Yes. So it's that interesting question of like, if I function in my life like a rebel or an outlaw, then how am I going to respond to love or a job opportunity or a fight or a conflict? And it's going to be very different than how the lover might respond to those things. Okay, one more for the road. There's so many good ones. I love these. Okay. Okay, this one.
Ooh. That's a harder one. Yeah, it's like mystic, cosmic. I almost want to. Yeah, occultist. I want to say the sage, but it's more than that. Yeah, it's like almost.
Yeah.
So which one is that?
It's the mystic.
Mystic, yeah.
It's the mystic, but you mentioned the sage, which I have as this.
Yeah, that's probably more sage, but yeah, it was like that definitely fits. But yeah, that's definitely the mystic. Which, so I mean, it's a perfect lead-in. I don't know where you're gonna go after that, but that's Pisces. I mean, like, this is all Pisces in some sense. That's why it's interesting. You've kind of culled the idea of the archetype, and then I think you didn't use this word during the recording, but in terms of when you initially wrote me about the idea of the unconscious, Pisces relates to the sea. And so I've talked about inner worlds, but in terms of depth of being, you know, that's also another way in which we could talk about Pisces, being in touch with our depth of being, which is the fount from which all these different, as you described them, archetypes come. So that relates to, at the heart, the mystic who tries to do that, right? But the mystic also comes to see him or herself in the dimensions of all the other archetypes as well. And that's kind of the deeper mystery. Like, if you don't perceive the outlaw in yourself, you haven't looked hard enough. If you don't perceive the sage in yourself, you haven't looked hard enough. Kind of going along with what you said at the beginning of our recording, which is you have all 12 signs of the zodiac in you. It's just a matter of in what degrees, literally, and in what measure. So I think the key in understanding astrology is kind of fathoming and plummeting and plumbing the depths of that being that has all of it.
And it's so beautiful that you're saying that, because a lot of this work comes out of archetypal depth psychology, right? This idea that there are these archetypes of consciousness that live in all of us, especially with the sun being in Pisces right now. It's this, I think, this opportunity to allow our identity to expand. And
That's
it's
right.
not so crystallized into one expression of the self, but allowing us to explore the depths of the myriad of personalities or planets or signs or elements or deities or Orisha that live in us, and to allow them to speak to us in a way and to get to know them in a way.
And I do want to give you a little gentle pushback. I mean, I wouldn't be Sam
Yes.
if I didn't give some gentle pushback. I mean, where I take some measure of issue in the formulation of that language is going back to just what you just showed, the mystic. There is the encounter that we have with the divine or divinities that isn't just about them as archetypes.
There's a difference between knowing an archetype, knowing of it intellectually. I know who Oshun is. I might know some of her signatures and that sort of thing in this kind of Western American context, right? And there's a difference between that and being in a system, a spiritual system that allows me ritual and direct access to a divine power.
And what you're kind of clarifying, and I think we agree, I just wanted to make sure and point out that those are different things.
Yeah.
You know, in terms of how we know and intellectualize and encounter that is not the same as the intimacy of one's relationship with your God or daemon.
I think we could say the same thing with astrology. Or
and how? I'm not disagreeing, but I just want to know what you mean.
In the sense of, you know, my understanding of astrology is that the planets were not just planets, but the planets were gods. I think the closest that I can even speak to that or come close to that kind of power, that kind of awe or reverence, is when I went to see the solar eclipse a couple of years ago. And
you mean out west? Did you go out west? You went to?
I went to South Carolina.
South Carolina, okay.
Yeah. And so, you know, here we are. It's like, you know, tailgating central. Everybody's out in the big parking lot with their beers and their drinks and their kids and their blankets and all those things. And there's kind of like the spectacle of it. You know, you can get your glasses and they're like, I saw the eclipse and all of that. And then there was that moment where the sun went black and completely dark. It was such a moment of, whoa, the power and the awesomeness of this luminary. The intellectual understanding of astrology versus the living my life by the planets versus I know who Oshun is versus being a devotee of Oshun are very different worlds. And
we inadvertently or advertently actually have just kind of summed up the axis between Pisces and Virgo, right?
Ooh.
Between Mercury and Jupiter.
Can you say more?
Jupiter, especially in his domicile in Pisces, is the experience of that emotional, intimate encounter that we have with the grandness of life. Whereas Mercury in his domicile in Virgo becomes much more of a different kind of intimacy, which is a lot more intricate, a lot more detail-oriented, a lot more conditioned by external measure, material measure. You know, that's a whole different experience, you know, having lived from the inside out. What seems like a disparity, but there's room for both. I think per what you're saying, it's kind of knowing when to apply the wisdom of that, which is the essence of astrology. Know when to apply the essence and the wisdom of the moment.
Kairos.
Right.
That's my favorite word.
And it's
the opportune moment. Just building on what we're saying and this idea of tapping into archetypes and archetypes proper, and looking at some of the archetypes in the media. Coming up this month on March 10th, I'm having a free webinar called How to Sit on Your Throne. And we're going to be looking at the archetypes of the queen And how do we bring out the queen into our lives in 2020? And I'm so excited about it because I know we've had a few offline conversations about Game of Thrones. But what we're going to be doing in this webinar is looking at some of our favorite queens from media and popular culture and looking at what flower essences awaken those archetypes within us. So we're going to be looking at the 3 GOT queens, Queen Cersei, Queen Sansa, and of course Daenerys. We're going to be looking at the Queen Bee. We're going to be looking at Michelle Obama, and we're going to be looking at Ya Santewa as some examples of different types of queendomness that we can bring into our.
You have one on there I have to ask you, and sorry to interrupt you, but there was one on there that I was completely baffled by. So why is Harley up there?
I think when I initially wrote you, I had just seen the movie the night before, and I was like, this is an archetype, and where does it fit into our culture? There's definitely flower essences that bring out that Harlequin, like laughing through life and, you know, that kind of thing. We look at Joseph Campbell, The Power of Myth, this idea that the media is art imitates life and life imitates art. So frequently through the media, we see this reemergence or redefinition or reclaiming of a particular archetype. Definitely using this cycle as an opportunity to explore the archetypes that are living within us and that are acting through us, I think is an even bigger invitation. In honor of Women's History Month, the featured flower essence for this month is Queendom. So Queendom is all about, again, sitting on your throne, knowing how to assert your power in the world, but almost in a way we're reimagining what power looks like. You know, reimagining that, you know, oftentimes we think about power as being something that's disconnected from feeling. And as we re-envision what power looks like, as we re-envision what leadership looks like and what that looks like in our own lives, it's an invitation to allow the divine masculine and the divine feminine to work together as we stand in power, with compassion, as we stand in power and make decisions, not just from our minds, but from our hearts, and all of those things.
Absolutely.